Thank you so very much for all of you for joining us, including the surprise guests that have joined in this morning. And just as a quick background as to where sort of this idea was generated from, um, recently, while preparing a conversation in which Professor Butt had participated regarding the Passions, Bach's Passions, it coincided with me reading Professor Koerner's fantastic book. While listening to the Passions and sort of studying the Passions and reading this incredible book, I couldn't help but sort of in the back of my mind think of how, or rather wonder why I was feeling there was some sort of some connection. And I don't mean a literal or a direct connection, but I felt there was something there that was eluding my understanding and my grasp. And then I started looking into it just a little bit more to see if there was anything I could find that had been written on the subject specifically of Johann Sebastian Bach and the visual arts. And in Mr. Wolff's book, I found precisely that link. And so perhaps we can get started with Professor Wolff and our first topic, which is maybe just setting the scene in terms of cultural life in Leipzig while Johann Sebastian Bach was there. And then perhaps Professor Wolff, you can talk to us a little bit about how you started to explore the idea of the connection between the Man of Sorrows and the Passions.
Okay, uh, thank you, Camilo. I'm happy to do that. I started actually by taking the beginning of the Arioso of the St. John Passion literally. It starts, betrachte meine Seele, behold my soul. And if you take the Brockes original, it even says, drum Seele schau. That is an invitation to look at something, and the image to be contemplated is, I believe, an obvious choice, namely the iconic image of the Schmerzensmann, the man of sorrows, a devotional image that exists in countless painted and printed versions. And there's also related to it a Lutheran congregational hymn, Du großer Schmerzensmann, of 1663, with a setting among Bach's four-part chorales. So Bach is invoking something that is most likely very familiar to the audience, if the audience pays attention to the music and the text. Probably not everyone does, but I think let's take it for granted at the moment. Now, I suggest that both the poet Barthold Heinrich Brockes and Bach were inspired by the devotional imagery of the dead Jesus Christ with the crown of thorns surrounded by angels and flowers. And then, Bach chooses a completely new instrumental sound. He departs from the standard orchestra of the St. John Passion and introduces only once in this entire Passion an instrumental accompaniment with viola d'amore. And, this is a completely different sound from the regular violins. So Bach deliberately creates a moment of quiet contemplation immediately following the brutal and bloody flagellation of the biblical narrative. And I think that is very important to see this contrast. And we may, at a later point, perhaps juxtapose the two related passages in the St. Matthew and the St. John Passions in order to understand the very different approaches Bach is taking here. So I would say throughout his life, Bach, like everyone else, saw himself surrounded by innumerable visual representations of the biblical passion story across the centuries. You could not avoid it. You find it in every church. You find it in private homes. You find it in the Bibles, in the hymn books, and so forth. Yet, what evidence do we have regarding Johann Sebastian Bach's specific interest in and appreciation of the visual arts? The short answer is not very much. The topic Bach and the visual arts has not really been explored as such. We know of 20th century artists like Paul Klee and Lionel Feininger, who are making use of Bach's music in order to find inspiration for their art. But Bach's interest in the visual arts is hard to define and to systematically explore. But let me make 4 specific points. First of all, Johann Sebastian Bach collected musicians' portraits, paintings and engravings on a modest scale. He had himself and his wife painted several times, although the paintings of Anna Magdalena Bach are lost, and of his own portraits we have only one authentic portrait, the Hausmann painting that is in Leipzig. But then Carl Philipp Emanuel, his second son, continued the portrait collection on a very different scale and expanded it in a way that is quite incredible. C.P. Bach's estate catalog lists 400 plus paintings, drawings, and prints, the largest such known collection of musicians' portraits in the 18th century. Of course, he defined musicians quite liberally. It included, for example, a portrait of Martin Luther, who was not exactly a musician, but he is known to have played the lute, and he also did a little bit of composing. But then it also included a Renaissance engraving of the Roman wine god Bacchus, with the annotation, jokingly, I think C.P. Bach puts it, founder of musical schools. Of course, that is pure fantasy, but it's one way of expanding a collection of musicians' portraits and related to the family. Second point, Johann Sebastian Bach the Younger, 1748 to 1778, C.P. Bach's son, studied art with the painter Adam Friedrich Oeser in Leipzig, made a study trip to Rome, and died there at the early age of 30. He is best known for idyllic landscapes and portraits. And in general, talent for drawing and painting can be found elsewhere in the Bach family. Cousins Gottlieb Friedrich Bach and Johann Philipp Bach, the godson of Carl Philipp Emanuel, were employed as both musicians and court painters, so that connection exists. My third point, Bach's interest in antiquarian books included a richly illustrated Marian Bible, published in 1704. He acquired it in 1744. Today, on permanent loan at the Leipzig Bach Archive, the famous book underscores the attention Bach apparently paid to biblical imagery in general. Finally, the fourth point, in Bach's country, the city of Dresden had a long-standing reputation of a place where the arts flourished in abundance. Dresden is often referred to as the Florence or Rome of the North. And Leipzig doesn't belong into that category. On the other hand, according to a 19th century saying, the money earned in Leipzig is spent in Dresden, definitely applies to earlier centuries as well, because the economic power of the city of Leipzig enabled the government in Dresden to splash and build fantastic structures and compile art collections and so forth. The university and business town of Leipzig always functioned as the economic center of Saxony until the present day. The artworks in the Leipzig churches and in private hands of wealthy merchants at the time of Bach were by no means insignificant. I'll give you one example. The merchant and town councillor Johann Zacharias Richter, 10 years younger than Bach, owned a private gallery, the so-called Kunstkabinett, containing more than 400 paintings and more than 1,000 drawings and numerous prints. Richter married in 1744 Sibylla Bose, Anna Magdalena Bach's friend of heart, as she referred to Sibylla. And in 1745, the Richters actually moved next door to the cantor's apartment on St. Thomas Square in Leipzig. There, Bach would have been able to admire major masterworks by Rubens, Rembrandt, Titian, and others, really quite extraordinary masterworks. That said, we'll unfortunately never know what J.S. Bach thought of Rembrandt, Titian, or any specific works of visual art. That's my introductory remarks.
And it's absolutely fascinating. I'm wondering if, considering the complete lack of evidence or of documents that could support anything, with that sort of in mind, do we have any? Is there any evidence, Professor Wolff, of in general how well received these art galleries were, whether or not they were actually popular destinations? Did other wealthy merchants visit each other's collections? Was it the public at large?
We know not much about it. We know that some of the private art collections, the Kunstkabinetts, for example, of the Gottfried Winkler collection in Leipzig, were made available one afternoon free of charge. I think Wednesday afternoon free of charge to the Leipzig public. So these collections were accessible and were by no means kept secretly. There was no public museum in Leipzig. Public museums didn't exist at the time. Therefore, the accessibility of major art collections, was something very special. And definitely Bach had the opportunity, especially with Richter living next door, but we simply do not know whether he and his wife or his family members had a habit of visiting art galleries, or whether they were really looking very specifically at certain artworks in the Leipzig churches or in churches elsewhere. I mean, there are certainly a number of major artworks. I think of the Lucas Cranach altarpiece, in the Weimar church, really major work of art. Bach would not have neglected it, but we simply do not know anything about what he might have thought about it, or how he appreciated works of the visual arts, or architecture, or anything like it, since we have very little in terms of personal communication in the Bach correspondence. The Bach correspondence is very businesslike, and contains very little in terms of reflections on contemporary life, and also on his friends and colleagues.
Fascinating. Professor, but perhaps we could continue with you, and in a perhaps more conceptual, more abstract sort of realm, in the idea of modernity, which is of course a key component of your work on the Passions, on Bach's Passions. Could we? Is it could we discuss perhaps a link between this idea of modernity that's found in and that you've highlighted in Bach's Passions with other mediums? I know that you reference literature a bit in your book. Would it be completely unwise to perhaps expand that to other arts and to other cultural manifestations? What are your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, Christoph talked about the problems of relating Bach to anybody, really, in a certain sense, because we just do not have the evidence for who he knew and what he thought of the people he knew. So I've sort of spent a lifetime actually linking Bach to people for whom there's no evidence that he was linked, but in the hope that the way people were thinking in his time and beyond his time, in fact, has resonances with what he was doing actually as a composer. Obviously very speculative, but I think the thing that really got me into this way of thinking is the fact that we all tend to relate to Bach very personally. We feel that Bach is almost one of us when we hear the music, yet he also feels archaic in other respects. He feels from a different age. And I think this is exactly what was felt in the 19th century when he was first rediscovered, and all the way through Bach reception. Everybody has felt a very close connection with him, even though it's very clear that he's not exactly of our age. So the connection I make is between the broader mindsets of modernity, with the proviso that modernity doesn't mean to say that Bach is necessarily up to date or fashionable or indeed secular. Those are the three things that are often thought of as modern, the secular age, up to date, and so on. That's something completely different, I think. When we're talking about modernity in historical terms, we're talking about a very large change of mindsets beginning in the 16th century, accelerating in the later 18th century, and then reaching its sort of fulfillment in the 19th and 20th centuries. Exactly what happens after that is perhaps for another day. But what am I relating modernity to, and what actually is it? Well, I think in one way we can actually pinpoint it right back to the Reformation itself and to Luther in particular. And of course, one thing that Luther made very important was the notion of individual responsibility for salvation and for the honing of one's spiritual personality and one's spiritual life. And that's, of course, taken up by the Counter-Reformation too, with the sort of various spiritual exercises and so on. So that notion then of individual responsibility for salvation, I think, does gradually become part of a change in our concept of the individual and towards a concept that is still, in some degrees, still with us. Another thing that I think is very important for this whole way of thinking is the autonomous pursuit of different aspects of knowledge and activity, so that one has, for instance, the modern sciences, which go as far as experimentation takes you, even if it contradicts what one has inherited from past knowledge. One might become a theologian, or one might become a philosopher, or indeed a novelist or an artist. One pursues one's interest and research in that field as far as it goes without necessarily trying to join all the different fields together. This is not to say that in Bach's time there weren't many people who were interested in the concept of natural theology and the idea that theology and science might still belong together. But I think that in some ways was almost the end of a particular way of thinking. So this notion then of independence of different fields and autonomy of different fields, I think, covers several aspects of life in the period from Luther to the present time. Another thing that I think became particularly important in the 17th century is the increasing legitimacy of artificiality. In other words, artificiality was thought of as not natural, not godly, something very poor, a poor imitation, as it were, of the real. But I think it's in the 17th century that people started to realize that actually some artificial things are quite useful, such as paper money. And one might think of, for instance, the modern novel, which begins in this period, as being completely made up, but is a useful fiction, a fiction which helps train one in a particular worldview or a particular trajectory of life. And therefore, it's, even though it's artificial, it's serious in a sense. And I think one finds something of this in some of the best composers of the 17th and 18th century, that their music is finished in a way that it doesn't have to be finished for the purposes for which it was required. It goes beyond that. It has a degree of autonomy in a certain sense. One might also think of politics and government and the notion of an ordered hierarchy underneath an absolute monarchy as a rationalization of what used to be a whole range of different forms of authority and government. In other words, a rationalization and a sort of the notion of the artificial monarch, who we, as it were, authorize to rule us, is very much there, for instance, in Thomas Hobbes's writing in England in the mid 17th century. And I think it's a very useful way of conceptualizing the notion of absolute rule, and why it was actually more a modern invention than what we tend to think today as a sort of archaic invention. So the notion then of individual sovereignty being shared and then donated, as it were, to the Commonwealth is something which is very much growing at this time. One thing I need to stress at this point is that when I talk about modernity, it's never pure. There's very seldom anything like pure modernity, except perhaps in some forms of fascism. In other words, modernity is always connected to the non-modern, the pre-modern, and so on. So, for instance, religion and modernity work together, even though they don't necessarily always match at every point. One's sense of identity, again, is often non-modern. So, in other words, there's always a mixture of the modern movements, as it were, and less modern or pre-modern identities. And I think Bach is a figure who very much, I think, would be described in some respects as a pre-modern mentality, yet a lot of his achievement and his way of thinking plays what I would say dialogues with modernity. As I said before, Bach was not necessarily exposed to any key figures, but what I suggest is that his music often reflects or actualizes aspects of the modern and pre-modern worldviews in very interesting ways. For instance, in the concept of the individual versus the community, how one hears in an aria an individual voice part fitting into a background which is often quite perfect in its own right through the ritornello structure. And sometimes there can be quite a distinction between the individual's loss of stability and the stability of the music. And I mean, a typical example of this is Ach mein Sinn from John Passion, which has perhaps the most ordered musical structure of any piece in the Bach Passions, with a repeating ritornello, yet the tenor line is completely lost all the way through and very seldom ties into that. So one gets a sort of sense of background order versus individual searching. Erbarme dich is another example of a singer who cannot actually sing the violin part, which is so beautiful and so perfect as an 8-bar ritornello, but you sort of hear it's the very failure of the singer and attempts to be joined into that background order that is so striking. So in other words, quite often one can find in Passions and many other cantatas of Bach, the notion of a voice both becoming more independent of the ritornello in some respects, but also as an auditor of the instruments. One often sort of hears the singer listening. So there's a greater sense then of a real human subject being modeled by the vocal parts of many Bach arias, particularly because of the strength of the structure. The ritornello style in particular is so rigorous in terms of musical economy. Another area that particularly interests me is time consciousness, in the way that I think Bach had a very intense awareness of how our concentration works in time. If one's talking about passion, one might think of successive verses of one of the particular chorales that repeats. Christus der unselig macht in John Passion, and of course the Passion chorale in the Matthew Passion. And it's almost as if one's time consciousness is exercised on a longer scale by those repetitions, iterations of the same melody, new verse of the chorale. But I think it's also there in the way the motivic structure often works. In other words, Bach often reminds us of a motive or introduces a motive that's going to become part of a later aria. Ich will dir mein Herz verschenken, for instance. That motive is there in the Jesus consecration of the bread and wine section. And it's almost as if Bach seeds particular ideas in our mind in order to exercise our memory, our punctual consciousness, you could say, the pinpoint in time, and stretch it so that we become more real in our own time zones. It's part of the meditation of the music, in other words. And I think something which was not fully theorized really till the 20th century with Edmund Husserl and people like that. And I really do feel that Bach had a great insight into how we memorize, how we remember things, but also how our consciousness can be stretched. And my final point is the notion of hermeneutic thinking, which in Bach research is often little more than exegesis. You know, here's a motive, it means that, and you sort of crack the code. I think Bach's writing and his understanding of meaning is much more subtle than this. First of all, I think one thing that's coming in Bach's time is the notion of viewpoint. It's something that's there in Leibniz's thought, even in the concept of the monad, where each individual monad has its own viewpoint. Even though the viewpoint is technically of everything, it's still from a particular angle. And this is taken over by hermeneutes in Bach's own environment, such as Martin Cladenius in Leipzig, or Claden, as he's sometimes called, who says that, yes, it's all very well writing a text or analyzing a text in terms of its meaning, but you need to take into account that the reader is going to come from a different sort of background, or various different types of background, and that it's a process of listening and reading as well as a process of production. In other words, again, it's not straight code cracking as we often are led to believe, but something of a much more iterative process of give and take. And my view is that Bach intuited this in the way he wrote music, not least because, of course, he could sometimes use the same piece of music for different texts. But I think the way he wrote music is, as it were, with hooks, emotional hooks, which set in train various emotions in connection with various texts. If you bring a particular type of thought to that text, if you bring a different thought to the text, you'll get something different. And this, what I would call hermeneutic flexibility, I think is one of the things that has made Bach's music so intensively relevant for people, even if they don't share the theological standpoint. They can still, there's still a sense of what I would call meaningfulness in the way the music is written. It adheres to the concepts with which it might originally have been endowed, but there's also this built-in notion that a different listening point, a different viewpoint, will bring in a different nuance to the meaning, one that is potentially infinite. And I think that's, again, one of those things that makes Bach's music so enduring. So a dialogue, in other words, with emerging modernity, while writing still very much within a pre-modern conception of the world. There's a lot of sort of medieval thinking, I think, in some of Bach's view of harmony and so on. But it's this wonderful playing in of modern thinking, which I would put right back to the time of the Reformation as a starting point, and that somehow continues to join with us today. So I hope that's not too speculative and vague, but I've always been fascinated with how why it is that Bach is of such broad appeal today and throughout reception.
No, absolutely, and I think this whole topic of Bach and connections with the visual arts is entirely speculative. I think we all sort of we know we're operating in that sort of terrain. Professor, but there's something that I've been meaning to ask you because you mentioned in your book the importance of rhetoric in Bach's compositions, and again in the murky terrain of speculation. One of the things that echoed in my mind while reading your book was the fact that rhetoric has a certain structure and certain mechanisms that seem to echo in different mediums. And I was wondering if perhaps you had any thoughts on that in terms of a connection between not a direct or literal connection between the passions that Johann Sebastian Bach would have composed, but in terms of the mechanisms of rhetoric, would there be a connection between what Bach would compose and what perhaps would be painted in a visual representation of the
Oh,
passion?
well, I can't quite answer that, but I can sort of at least set some ground of the ground for that. I think rhetoric is very interesting. Sometimes, again, I think it's misused in scholarship, that it's just seen as a way of cracking codes, and it's also often seen as something very sort of objective in a way. And I think it's actually much richer than that. And that one of the reasons I think rhetoric became so popular in the 16th century with the rediscovery of Quintilian and restoration of Cicero and so on is because rhetoric from the ancient world does actually take account of the audience. And it's that, and that was becoming important in the 16th and 17th century. How do you take account of the audience? How do you convince an audience of something? So I think rhetoric has this, as I was talking about hermeneutics just a minute ago, rhetoric actually brings with it this notion of how do you get behind the psychology of your listener or your viewer or your reader. And I think this is something that one would find across the arts, because everybody, particularly in Lutheran Germany, but beyond as well, would have been brought up with rhetoric as one of the sort of fundamental tools of education. And I think as long as we see it as something dynamic, and again, something which involves a circulation between producer and receiver, then it's a very useful model. And it's something that we can see constantly in Bach in terms of how things repeat, the way they repeat, the timing of repeats, and so on. So it's a model that it's in some ways so much there that it's very hard to say anything new about it. But on the other hand, it's very easily becomes ossified into a formula. And I think it's important to try and avoid the formulaic approach when one's talking about music, and I would imagine art as well.
I think it might be important to backtrack a little. Before talking about rhetoric, I think one should realize that music actually is a language, and that Bach is interested in communicating, whether it's instrumental music or whether it's vocal music with words. He wants to communicate. He wants to, let's say, in his church music, he wants to support the teaching of the Christian message, and the art of rhetoric is teaching also the musician how to communicate effectively. And I think it provides the means to provide a deeper means to communicate meaningful and to really touch the listener. And that is the goal of Bach's music, really touching the listener and making him perhaps understand things in a different way that, without the way he communicates musically would not be possible.
And when I hear different scholars express ideas like what Professor Wolff just expressed, I can't help but think that there is an enormous similarity between music and the visual arts. especially when we get into the realm of Christian imagery and the way that rhetoric is used in Christian imagery. And I'd like to, a little bit later, perhaps we can talk a little bit about this. This idea of how rhetoric was used in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance to create a certain kind of image of the Passion, to evoke and to communicate reactions, specific reactions in the audience. Professor Koerner, perhaps before we get into the sort of topics that we had thought about discussing with you specifically, there's something that I wanted to ask you about in relation to the idea of modernity, because I couldn't help thinking about it while I was reading your book, and I had just previously read Professor Butt's book. You mention Heidegger, and you mention his essay on the world, the world as an image, or the
world picture.
Right, exactly, and how Heidegger defined that as the moment, that the defining moment in modernity. Could you maybe just share with us a little bit more about that in terms of what he meant by that?
Well, he kind of ticks off a little bit along the lines of Professor Butt, ticks off the characteristics of modernity: the removal of God from the world, the rise of science and technology, of techne, ideas of individualism, the individual, the understanding of the human as culture rather than something divine. So the study of the human as culture, the beginning of anthropology. And then he takes all those traditional understandings of what happened in the modern world and steps back and says that what characterizes modernity is not just that it has this world picture, that its world picture is scientific, its world picture is individualistic, its world picture is one in which everything is humanly created rather than found, as it were. Everything is made, not found. And he says, no, it's wrong to think about the modern modernity as a world picture, but rather that the very idea of having a picture of the world is the characteristic mark of modernity. That the mark of modernity is a kind of imagined structure of experience and the world, in which the world is conceived of as being something the viewer looks over at as a unified whole, as a subject over against objects. And so he makes this, to my view, not thoroughly convincing, but nonetheless very useful idea that when the world is represented as picture, and just think also of perspectival representation, of the beginning of perspectival representation in Renaissance art, of the relationship between the idea of a painting as a representation of the world out there through an open window. He juxtaposed that to medieval representations of the world, where they're more schematic, they're more diagrammatic, and they basically assume that there won't be a picture of the world because the only viewer of the world will be God. God is the subject of a display which we are part of, rather than looking over at it as a kind of stationary subject. So for him, it's a kind of bad story. It's a negative story. It's the fall. It actually inhabits almost all either right or left-wing views of art history in the Renaissance. That is, that the Renaissance brought something great, but also problematic in the idea of the stationed human subject looking out over the world. It's associated with colonialism. It's associated with imperialism, with power relations, but Heidegger sees it as a kind of structural transformation, and he's playing around with the idea that was very much present in German cultural history, which was that every era has its own picture of the world. It either is called a world picture or a world view, Weltanschauung, and those terms were very politically fraught. Because Nazism was considered to be a Weltanschauung, something which which sort of legitimized an idea of power and of politics, which people then contested around that term. So Heidegger comes along and introduces this idea of the world picture and then says world pictures are themselves not plural, but they become plural and they become a picture in the modern era. That's the signature of modernity.
Super, incredibly fascinating. And it sort of to build on that, after the Reformation, the use of images, of course, changes. It doesn't disappear, but it
Right.
changes. And you mentioned something in an email exchange that we had, in terms of how we define image and how we might be able to define imagery within a Lutheran church. And I thought it was absolutely incredible. Could you maybe share a little bit about that with us?
Okay, great. So the idea of Luther as being a tragedy for the visual arts in Germany is a kind of commonplace. And the idea, even within that, is that German culture moved from a visual culture to a musical or language-based culture because of the intervention of Luther and 30 Years' War. And it's the case that in some important way, the Luther's breakthrough expressed in his 1517 theses, which he posted in 1517, was economically disastrous for artists. Here, this is a wonderful polemical image celebrating the Reformation, in which Luther, with his gigantic pen, writes the theses and shakes the earth. But what happened immediately was basically the economy of art fell through the floor, which was that the economy of for most artists was making art for the purpose of church donations. You gave works of art to the church, and giving works of art was a good work, a meritorious donation. Like you can see all these people bringing things in this Catholic image to the accounting table of the Lord, and a payback bringing to the table just a sort of form of embodied capital. And images were directly related to the idea of works. You had images like I'm bringing this in, like the Man of Sorrows, which were directly associated with indulgences. That is, if you read the prayer to this facsimile of the Man of Sorrows as found in an icon in Rome, you would actually get a certain amount of days or years or tens of thousands of years in some promises, less punishment in purgatory. So images were related to this treasury of the church. So Luther comes along and says these good works are not effective for salvation. And he also, because he finds this, he has this vision in a reading of the gospel. Actually, it's reading Romans, the book, the letter to the Paul's letter to the Romans. There's also a strong idea that the primary, in fact, the only mediation point of the word of God is going to be words, either spoken or heard. The living word in preaching, the read word in reading the Bible, maybe the sung word in a hymn, privileging the word over the visual in the Lutheran turn. And this gives rise to quite an elaborate, I could show hundreds of images of this kind, juxtaposition of Lutheranism or the evangelical church versus the Catholic Church as something to do with a visual culture versus a verbal culture. Here is a polemical image against the Catholic Church, in which the only reason why you know it's polemical against is because there's so much profusion of activities. It's almost like an anthropology of the activities of the church, and also evidence-based religion is an objects-based religion. And over against the true religion in the pendant piece is one where everyone is listening to the preacher in the pulpit over on the right, and the whole structure of a church with a nave and aisles and a choir is counteracted by the spatiality of listening, where you have all these people on the stairs counteracting the architecture of the basilica, and he's sort of despatializing the church because it's a religion of the word. And Luther has a very interesting event that he remarks about in his tabletop talks, that when he was in Erfurt, there was a very bloody crucifixion. And he reports that he shrunk back and averted his eyes from it and would have rather glimpsed the devil than looking at this, just because he felt that crucifixions, I'm just showing here the Grunewald, these bloody crucifixions had as their effect making one feel so sinful and so terrified that one couldn't repent. And his news was a good news given through the word, rather than this kind of pathos-ridden imagery, which was kind of uncontrollable. But lo and behold, Luther and art picks up on these and kind of tames and transforms the idea of the bloody cross. Here's a Lucas Cranach the Younger, amazing altarpiece in which the crucifixion is placed within an actual image of the heart. And it's the idea that already here that the proper relationship to images has to be more internal rather than external. And it relates directly to Luther's, here a cookie cutter version of his coat of arms as a cross within the heart within a rose. So the idea of somehow some kind of, there is an image, but it also is internalized. But while Luther is having this breakthrough, crucially, not only were works of art being repudiated as good works, as a kind of specious form of salvation, economics, understanding of salvation, but they were also beginning to be understood as idols and therefore as things that had to be destroyed. And so when Luther escapes papal prosecution in the Wartburg Castle, an iconoclastic preacher begins to actually preach iconoclasm in Wittenberg, and a large proportion of Wittenberg's arts is destroyed. It's interesting listening to the conversation before that one of the things that the iconoclast Karlstadt says about images and why they should be destroyed, besides the fact that the Old Testament says you shouldn't have that God says you shouldn't have that they are idolatrous. He also says, against the view which had been resident in Christian culture since the Middle Ages, since Gregory the Great, that images are Bibles for the poor, that they're Bibles for the illiterate. He said, what do we learn from Christ, an image of Christ? Only that his head hangs down, that he bled from the wounds. We don't learn anything about Christ. So there's a kind of tautological understanding of an image, that it isn't actually rhetoric. It's not communication. There's no communication that images do. Therefore, it's not quite like rhetoric. There might be an image rhetoric, but according to the radical iconoclasts, the rhetoric actually doesn't communicate. Words communicate, images just incite idolatry. Like this image of the Mass of St. Gregory with the Man of Sorrows at the center, and somebody's gone at the image with a sharp instrument to repudiate the looking at that image. Luther, though, famously, and in one of the most famous moments in his life in terms of his social and political practice, comes back from the Wartburg and stops, here a 19th century image of it, stops the iconoclasm. He says, he stops there Karlstadt from this undertaking. And he stops it mainly because it's a disorderly thing, because the princes don't want their art and their property to be taken away from them. He stops them. And he says, for the sake of order and for the sake of poor people who might be scandalized by this, be iconoclasts. He also says that images have a role. They can be Bibles for the illiterate. They can, he even goes so far as to say they might have some emotional impact. But then he makes a very interesting argument whereby he says there's actually no way that I can hear the word Christ and not see the image of Christ. That the moment I hear the word Christ, a picture forms in my heart, or in my head, or in my heart, of a man on the cross. That's the way we are built as human beings. We're always going to picture things. And so after his death, the artist Lucas Cranach paints Luther preaching from the pulpit there, pointing from the gospel which he's reading to the content of. But it's a very interesting image. It's an image where, for example, the blood doesn't actually drip on the ground. It's a kind of cleaned up image, an abstracted image, a painting that says, don't think that this is the crucifixion. Don't think that and don't even have the kind of pathos-ridden experience of it. You should understand that this is just an image. The blood doesn't affect it doesn't go into our world. This becomes the predella, or a foundation panel, for the most important Reformation altarpiece in Luther's preaching church of Wittenberg. And one of the interesting things about this is, first of all, it's a kind of exemplum of later Reformation art, but it looks basically very similar to a Catholic altar piece. Unless you look very carefully, you see it's a triptych form. The wings, though, don't close. It has the traditional representation you might think of the Last Supper, but it isn't completely traditional. The still living figures of the ministers are portrayed in the two sacraments besides communion that are countenanced by Lutheranism: baptism with Melanchthon officiating, and confession with Bugenhagen, who's at the time actually preaching, officiating. So it's as if the reformers are breaking and entering into the church space, putting their own portraits in the place of the. So it relates to the powerful presence of portraiture in Reformation art. But in this case, the image from a distance actually looks so much like a Catholic altarpiece that famously, when the Spanish troops after the Battle of Mühlberg took Wittenberg, they looked at this altarpiece and they said, well, it looks pretty much like a Catholic church. And in a way, it dissimulates Catholicism and tries to look like it's more traditional than it is, even though it has all these hints, like Luther here is receiving the chalice and he's in the outfit that he had when he was in the Wartburg Castle in disguise. So Lutheran churches actually are richly decorated spaces, but the way they organize themselves is radically different, is profoundly different than Catholic churches. And I show one of hundreds of examples, but it happens to be a very important Palatine chapel in a key Reformation strongholds, Schmalkald. And it shows a kind of programmatic instance of what the interior of church should look like. And what it does is it places the communion table where it would be, but it's also a baptismal font. And above it, so that all attention will actually be around the word, it places the pulpit in the first instance of what will become a standard part of Lutheran church furniture, the pulpit altar, in which the idea of the word, the dispensation of the word, the speaking of the word, and the distribution of the sacraments. Instead of an image, you literally have a preacher preaching the word. The living word is the image that takes the place of the altarpiece in the Reformation altar. And for the musicians, I suppose it's interesting that always in these arrangements, there's a place for the organ. And it's not by accident. It's the idea that somehow this has all become an auditorium rather than a sacral space of sacred places and sacred objects and sacred relics, but rather a space which is filled with the word, and with the word also spoken and preached and also turned into hymn and music. Probably the first and most important difference, actually, of the difference between Reformation space and pre-Reformation space is fixed seating. There was no fixed seating in Catholic churches before the Reformation. fixed seating is an artifact of the Protestant Reformation and the belief that preaching is the most important of the sacraments. And therefore it creates the auditorium as a structural space because it wants everybody in place. And that being in place actually forms an image. The pietists in the later period of Lutheranism said that the most beautiful image is a church with all the congregation, everyone in their seat. And here you see a pietistic community where it's the fact that everybody's sitting there and listening. That's the image that should be there. There shouldn't be a visual image. It should be the living image of church service. And I just end sort of with what remains of the image in the Lutheran context. Well, one thing is that images were destroyed. Some of them were brought into these amazing spaces called idol museums of atheism. They were showing all the horrible things that Catholicism did, including having images. And people would go into these chambers to see the horrors of pre-Reformation art. But then they became historical museums in various towns like Zittau. But most importantly, already in 1522, when the iconoclasm is started, images were being taken out of churches and put into Kunstkammer, that is, into art collections, as a way of neutralizing images, of taking away something to do with taking away the passions that images could generate, somehow diffusing the affective quality of the work of art by saying that these are beautiful things. And if we compare Dürer's amazing Man of Sorrows to, and here probably something maybe closer to what Luther might have, what Bach might have thought of for the Man of Sorrows, the amazing 1509 engraving with the Virgin and the evangelist being touched actually immediately by the blood of Christ. But a classic Lutheran image, the image which we know Luther was responsible for, was this image of the law and the gospel, an image in which the idea of works righteousness and trying to follow the law is represented as the bad side of the image, and believing in the gospel and believing in Christ's word is the good side. And yet there is a visuality here, a kind of palpable visuality, for example, in the way the blood pours out of Christ's wound onto the representative human. But this is a very different kind of image, not affective, more dogmatic, more theological. And it's paintings like this that made people say Luther is a tragedy of our art. It reaches all the way into Hegel and through the 19th century, that the kind of painting and the kind of visual images that Lutheran territories made was kind of deliberately diagrammatic, deliberately dampening all the forces. And where the force of German artistry came to the fore was in the form of music and was in the form of Bach. So I think the historiography will be that Bach and the visual arts in some chapter of it are seen as radically distinct, in the sense that the one is that Bach is the solution to this world of visual images and of a kind of empty rhetoric. So that's all I have.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Koerner. That was really, really very interesting. And to sort of use as a segue, Professor Wolff, in a lecture that I saw that you gave more or less recently, where you presented the ideas that you developed in your book regarding the Man of Sorrows. I don't have the specific quote, but I believe that you allude to the fact that Bach's music, and in particular the movements that you're discussing in the Passions, would have immediately and sort of automatically created the image or reminded the congregation of a specific image, of the image of the Man of Sorrows in the minds of the congregationists. And Professor Koerner just mentioned that as well, in terms of what Luther believed, that we always picture things, and and to sort of also connect to that idea of rhetoric. Could you perhaps, Professor Wolff, elaborate a little bit on that idea of um, how it would have been that the members of the congregations that Bach would have been performing for would have automatically referenced an image, even if they hadn't necessarily been exposed to the image physically repeatedly?
Well, there were many, many standardized images. And let me refer to the last painting that Joseph Koerner showed. You have two images on the right-hand side of the crucified Jesus, and then the victorious Jesus in a radiant appearance holding the flag of victory. So it's the image of Christ and victory over death. And at the same time, you are aware of that Jesus had been crucified and that he suffered a great deal. And, you know, this wide range of imagery of, you know, the passion story and its ending, and of course then the resurrection, is firmly engraved in, you know, every faithful's understanding of, you know, the biblical story. So I think Bach could play on this. And I don't think we need to point to very specific works of art, but I think certain iconic types that were clearly part of the imagery that every good Lutheran would be intimately familiar with, either from, you know, the pictures in the hymnal, pictures in the Bible, pictures hanging in the churches, and so forth. So I think it's very clear that you know, this contrasting kind of imagery plays a major role, specifically in the St. John Passion and its contemplative pieces. I refer to the aria Es ist vollbracht, you know, after Jesus died, and the viola da gamba solo, again, you know, a different sound from everything else we have heard in the St. John Passion. And in the middle of this aria, this explosive tutti, which addresses the hero of Judah, which, you know, in a way represents the image of Christ's victory over death, triumph over death. And, you know, in a similar way, you know, at the Arioso, which, you know, started our discussion, Betrachte meine Seele, which is part of the scene of the flagellation, the biblical scene of the flagellation. We can see how Bach, like, you know, a Lutheran preacher, will use the biblical text as a point of departure for very different interpretations of the text and make people aware of what's happening in the story. And maybe this would be a good place for two very brief musical excerpts. Camilo, if you would be so kind as to play from the St. Matthew Passion, the gospel section that introduces the flagellation, and that is followed by the Arioso, Erbarm es Gott, O Geißelung, O Schläg, with the violent beating, the dissonant chords, the sharply dotted rhythms that really presents a musical picture of the flagellation.
Da gab ihnen Barabbam los, aber Jesum ließ geißeln und überantwortete ihn, dass gekreuzigt würde. Beatus Jesum und einzelte ihn.
One is the St. Matthew Passion, the scene of the flagellation with the Arioso that really emphasizes now and puts into perspective the brutality of the beating of Christ, you know, with the dissonant chords and you know, the rhythms. Now in the St. John Passion, the same biblical scene, the flagellation, moves into a different direction. And we don't hear in the reflective music anything about the beating. You know, this is a thing of the past. So you look at, you know, it invites, behold my soul with anxious delight, and, you know, see how from the thorns that pierce him, heavenly primroses bloom. So it's a very peaceful image, and it's followed by an aria that focuses on the rainbow as the peace sign of God. So it is, you know, a deliberately peaceful representation of the image of the dead Christ. And maybe you can show the picture that I think is just typical of you know, the iconography of the Schmerzensmann, the man of sorrow. Yeah. See, you see flowers and a beautifully decorated Gobelin in the background, angels. So you don't see anything that relates to the flagellation. It's now inviting the people to think of this as as the intention of God to make peace with mankind. So it's a very different approach. And you know, Bach does what preachers do. They take the same biblical passage and interpret it in different ways. And therefore, I think what is also important in music, you don't want to hear things in the same way all the time. So Bach surprises the listener and maybe disappoints the listener who is awaiting now a violent piece of music, and all of a sudden, you know, this is music coming from a different world that makes the listener also hear in a very different way.
I was listening to the Arioso before this meeting, and I was struck by the what you're describing, the relationship, the flower, the rich metaphorical understanding of the blood, of the suffering. And I was reminded that much of this, including Meister Franke's relationship of the blood here to things that are beautiful. Obviously, it's related to the symbolism of the lily, but it's also related to mystic visionary literature in which the dripping blood was seen as simultaneously gruesome, horrible, and terrifying, but also through mystical metaphorical transformation was seen as rain pouring from heaven, as something that caused flowers to bloom. That the relationship between the ugly and the beautiful, the gruesome and the salvific, was built into the great passion poetry of the pre-Reformation era. People like Julian of Norwich and the late medieval passion tracts, where the blood is never blood per se. It's also something that leads you to a whole set of metaphors and associations which are themselves kind of comforting and beautiful.
Yes, and blood as a life-giving, element.
Yes.
I'm hoping I could add a quick word at this juncture. Anyone interested in delving further into this topic of Bach and the visual arts would do very well to consider this quite impressive tome titled Bach, eine Lebensgeschichte in Bildern. Christoph was responsible for this, and it came out in 2017. It's 470 pages. It's magnificently produced. Bärenreiter has brought it out in Europe. I don't believe there's a US edition yet, but there ought to be, and I've been talking to Christoph a little bit about this. But the book, as I say, is splendidly produced. Many images of source materials, manuscripts, and musical prints, but also engravings and paintings from the era. It's really like, I say to Christoph, it's like a mini museum in portable form, and this is well worth seeking out.
Thank you.
And Christoph, I hope that perhaps a US edition at some point. What inspired that project, Christoph?
Well, it was, this leads away from the present topic, but I think the idea was to collect all the pictorial documents that relate to the life story of Johann Sebastian Bach, and to really bring people closer to the period in which he lived.
Well, the book is quite an achievement and well worth seeking out.
But what I find important to return to is John's reference to opera. And this reminds me of perhaps one other piece of music where Bach is apparently deliberately invoking imagery that is familiar to everyone. And that is when he sets the stage for the second part of the Christmas oratorio. The angel announces to the birth of Christ. So, the traditional imagery of that scene in the fine arts, and Joseph might elaborate on it, is the mountains near Bethlehem with the shepherds taking care of their grazing sheep, and above in the clouds the angels making music, and the shepherds, not on every painting, but sometimes do have their bagpipes or other woodwind instruments, and there is a concert that you don't hear, but you see that the shepherds and the angels in different spheres are communicating, and Bach is doing exactly that in the Symphonia that opens the second part of the Christmas oratorio, where we have the angels with the sweet string instruments, and the shepherds with the six-fold oboes, which is the only time Bach uses that kind of instrumentation. So this really opens up as in an opera, a curtain that now unfolds and prepares for the storytelling that follows.
Thank you, Mr. Wolff. I'm wondering if Mr. Panetta or Mr. Stern, who are here, would like to add something at this point.
I'm fascinated. Unfortunately, I had to miss out on some of the conversation due to a conversation I had that was previously scheduled. But I think just from the operatics, the idea that Bach can operatize his music was so important in the way he wrote that. And I loved the idea, Professor Butt's idea, that the opera was actually not for the public, but it was in a way aimed at the expression of the soul. At the moment in D minor Mass, after the Crucifixus, before the Resurrexit, Bach galvanizes all his forces in something that is so huge that becomes more and more concentrated and more harmonically remote and complicated into this little passage where at the end you are staring at the abyss. And there's there's this moment when he writes also in a fermata to make sure that you do not start too quickly for the Resurrexit, and you have to wait and experience the abyss yourself in order to have the audience understand what the music is bringing. And if there's a moment, there's no moment in Puccini that outdoes this moment in Bach, where it's so clear that he's using his writing and his potential, his sound, to be able to communicate something that's so far beyond what liturgical music until then had established. That there's no other word for me than operatic for that moment, even though putting it into an opera context obviously is totally incorrect. But that interior operatic element is something that is key to Bach's greatest writing. And I find nothing better to support exactly what everyone is talking about this time, when taking the music and bringing it to a different level of understanding. So I find that fascinating.
Thank you, Mr. Stern. And I'm wondering if perhaps Mr. Ma has any thoughts on what we've been discussing. I've seen him writing notes, so I know that he's been following it carefully. So any thoughts, Mr. Ma?
Professor Montenegro, I am having such a great time and learning, and I'm a recovered student, and so I'm just taking it all in, and I'm just, it's stunning. There's so many thoughts, and I will think about all of them. And I think the only thing I could think of is that, from everything that you're saying, it confirms for me even more so that Bach was an inventor. He was constantly inventing. So you take the same flagellation scene, he comes up with varieties of answers of how to make something special, as what David was talking about. And I'm just stunned that the marriage of the visual and the words, rhetoric that Professor Butt talked about so much, is, to me, is all part of the exercise of imagination. And whether you go from the pre-Reformation to the Reformation, it's people are trying to communicate something, and the strength of each era, whether from a Heidegger point of view or whatever Weltanschauung is yes, there's a preference for something, but through that preference, you're trying to express the world through the lens of what's possible during each era. So I think the personal part of Bach speaks just as much to today to me from, again, what Professor Butt was talking about, the hooks, the emotional hooks. That's still, not quite code breaking, but the iterative parts, I think, do matter from one era to another, because it addresses something that is innately just so incredibly human.
And to sort of build on that idea, Mr. Ma, that you mentioned in terms of the inventiveness of Bach, and how you can represent something like the flagellation of Christ in multiple ways. I think one of the most amazing things that I've been learning while reading everyone's books and sort of researching these topics is precisely just how many different varieties or different ways of interpreting the story of Christ and the story of Christ's passion, either pictorially or with music. It's remarkable in how many different ways that can actually be done. Um, I'm wondering if perhaps the original conversation was scheduled for only an hour and a half. We're technically beyond that point now, and out of respect for everyone's time and everyone's schedule, um, I just want to point that out. Professor Koerner, any last thoughts? Anything that you would like to add at this point? Challenging questions or nuggets of
Uh,
wisdom?
well, yeah, I guess picking up from what Yo-Yo Ma was saying, it's interesting perhaps to think about the ways in which a particular culture and a particular technology and medium uh, opens up those possibilities for communication, because the art isn't doing it in Leipzig at that time. The art is not thinking in for all sorts of reasons. It's not the vehicle wherein all that kind of communication as well as invention comes in. But if you roll the film back and you look at Albrecht Dürer, you have exactly the same situation in a sense. You have the flagellation in the woodcut, small woodcut passion, the flagellation in the large woodcut passion, the flagellation in the engraved passion, all of those in dialogue with earlier flagellations. And there's a sort of stage managing of it, very specific to the medium, whether it's a small or a larger woodcut, or whether it's an engraving or a woodcut or a painting. So the stage management for the purpose not only of making you feel like you're there when the blows are being dealt on Christ's body, but also something to do with the amazement of the artist. Dürer is always putting his in a monogram. So there's an artistic self-consciousness that arises within those acts of restaging, which does go away in the visual arts at that particular point, but then comes back and had been there. But so there's a medial history of media, but also some constant around reformulating ancient, unbelievably powerful, almost mythical moments like beating of Christ.
Thank you for that, Professor Koerner. Professor Wolff, any last thoughts or questions?
Well, I think our conversation this morning or this afternoon made clear once again how multidimensional Bach's art is. Even if we can't pin everything down to hard facts, that is not necessary. I think it opens up all kinds of perspectives that help us to understand this extraordinary musician in a way that we can only continue to broaden our base for the discussion of the many secrets of musical art.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Wolff. Professor Butt, any last comments, any last thoughts?
Well, just bringing together a few things that have recently been said about the differences in the two stories, as it were, and the different ways of telling the same story. And this really brings to my mind the difference between the John and the Matthew Passion as set by Bach, because I think the John Passion sort of reminds us that what happened, as it were, in the past could happen again, is happening now, is happening in this sort of Johannine idea of recurring time, while the Matthew Passion is much more linear in many respects in terms of the story, in terms of the shocks along the way. And I think those two perspectives on the same story, regardless of one's religious standpoint, are extremely instructive and compelling for us, that we can see that any great story from the past, as it were, can, as it were, happen again in our present, but it can also be experienced in the pure sequence of the original story. So I think Bach has captured those two accents on the same story unbelievably well, and that is played out in the very act of performing and listening to these pieces.
Thank you, Professor Butt. Mr. Panetta, any last thoughts? Any challenges?
Well, I would like to simply extend my gratitude to you for presiding so ably and for organizing this marvelous session, which I've enjoyed thoroughly.
This really has been an incredible honor, and quite frankly, I could stay here for another 2 hours with you. I could stay here all evening. I can go grab a bottle of wine, and we can might be too early for the for some of you in the call, but thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Again, is there any sort of conclusion or any other additional comment we would like to make before we say goodbye on this occasion?
The only thing I would say is that if we had come to a firm conclusion, Bach would be a far less interesting composer.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.